Hello and good evening and welcome to the Kelly Writers House. First, we want to thank the Povich Journalism Programming Fund established by Maury Povich and Connie Chung for sponsoring this event, and thanks to the staff of the Kelly Writers House who've actually prepared a very nice reception with snacks and drinks out back, so we really hope that you'll stick around after the reading, hang out, and meet John in person if you'd like to. So there are two pieces of writing advice that I've been given in my life that stick with me. One came from an older artist who told me in my 20s that if I wanted to be serious, to absolutely refuse to give myself a backup plan. You want a backup plan? Back yourself against a cliff, he said. The other notable piece of advice, this one more to do with the actual craft of writing, came from our guest tonight, John Jeremiah Sullivan, back when he was my editor at Harper's magazine. I'd finished all my research and reporting for a piece, and John said in his suave yet gritty drawl that now the time had arrived for me to, and I quote, go right the fuck out of this. This was maybe a week after John had told me in regards to moving toward the conclusion of my research and reporting phase that it was time to pull in the ponies. If you read John, you'll find all kinds of great expressions like this. You will also, no doubt, agree with me that clearly he has taken his own advice. He wrote the fuck out of this thing. Pulphead has been called the most inspired book of essays since David Foster Wallace's A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. And James Wood, writing in The New Yorker, compared Sullivan's prose to that of master short story writers like Peter Taylor and Raymond Carver. He has been called the new Tom Wolfe and compared to Mark Twain. And while those two last comparisons clearly have nothing to do with his gimmicky wardrobe, I think it does say I think it does say a great deal about the essential and very big way that John probes down into the twisted apple core of the American psyche. One quote James Wood cited in his review is from John's piece about reality TV in his essay, Getting Down to What Is Really Real. A paragraph that I myself, when I read it, scribbled in the margin, best paragraph ever. Let me read it. And I quote, "People hate these shows, but their hatred smacks of denial. It's all there, all the old American grotesques, the test tube babies of Whitman and Poe, a great gauntlet of doubtless eyes, big mouths spewing fantastic catchphrase fountains of impenetrable self-justification, muttering dark prayers, calling on God to strike down those who would fuck with their money, their cash, and always knowing, always preaching, using weird phrases that nobody uses except everybody uses them now. Constantly talking about goals, throwing carbonic acid on our castmates because they used our special cup, and then called our mom to say in a baby voice, 'People don't get me here.' Walking around half naked with a butcher knife behind our backs. My God, there have been more tears shed on reality TV than by all the war widows of the world. Are we so raw? It must be so. There are simply too many of them, too many shows and too many people on the shows for them not to be revealing something endemic. That this is us, a people of savage sentimentality, weeping and lifting weights." That's just crazy great, right? But it's there in all these essays. He nails his subjects, their frailty and beliefs, their strangeness, yet never by resorting to condescension. And more often than not, by showing us some kind of previously unearthed beauty. And there's also this enlightened, awakened vibe running through his pieces where you get a real recognition of America's continuity, of the underlying interconnectedness, a sense of deep memory, a sense of the origins of who we are. He's always getting to the bottom of things this way, sometimes literally, as when he goes spelunking in Tennessee to see ancient cave paintings, but more often by seeking out the individuals who are somehow plugged into the primordial mainframe. Old bluesmen, cosmic naturalists. He seems to be interested deeply in the topic of mentors and muses, apprentices, the authentic, the original, and all the relations and cross-pollinations between. But even with subjects that are more purely contemporary, pure pop, like with Michael Jackson, John shows how that's all deeply rooted too. Throughout, you can sense him trying to hone in on his own internal clarity, on what he really, really, really thinks to the essence of the matter, employing a kind of scholarly zeal, and at the same time, he is insanely funny, often extravagantly bizarre, sometimes quietly paranoid, sometimes literally stoned, sometimes literally stoned at Disney World. And in those moments, his vital striving after that honest level-headedness gets wonderfully splattered with bursts of technicolor hilarity. That is to say, you will laugh your ass off reading John Sullivan. But ultimately, you sense that he is unraveling the true lineage of things, not only in personal history and political history. Do not miss his amazing piece about the Tea Party and Ben Franklin, but religion and science and always music. When he goes to Jamaica to meet Bunny Wailer of Bob Marley fame, the Rasta legend says to him how, quote, melody has to sing the message of how you feel. It has to have that kind of wailing type of melody that suggests you are actually experiencing something. You're not just singing about something that you heard about. And that's very much descriptive of John's own writing. Sometimes it all out wails. And when you read it, you too, the reader, get to actually experience something. Please let me introduce John Jeremiah Sullivan.
Wow. Thanks to all of you for coming out. This is a real honor for me. I want to thank the Kelly Writers House and Jessica and Ali and Andrew and especially Jay, who discovering his writing was one of the high water marks of my career when I was an editor at Harper's. Not just saying that in a quid pro quo kind of way. I've used him on many resumes since. I remember actually it was Jack Hitt, a writer we both revere a lot, who first told me to look out for his work, and it's lucky for me that I did, because that's started a relationship with that magazine that's led to many beautiful pieces. I thought that tonight I might read this essay about Michael Jackson, because I was just over in Germany for a couple of weeks doing a lot of readings and things, and it was the one piece that I never got to read for some reason. I don't know. People were a little freaked out by it over there. But mainly Michael has been on my mind lately, I guess because there's this new biography of him out that I just saw reviewed that I haven't read it yet. But also I heard a story about him that was just so great and just captured something about what's been lost to the world since he died. Something of his extravagance. And it was a story about 9/11, right after the attacks There were, you may remember, there were only a few planes allowed into the air in the hours in the day immediately after the attacks. A lot of them were used by Saudi princes. That was a strange fact of that day. The last people you'd think would be allowed into the air right after the attacks, given the sort of xenophobic atmosphere. But they were afraid for their lives. But another plane that was allowed to fly out of New York right after that day was a Sony plane. Sony had this private jet, and God knows how, but they'd convinced the White House to let them take off, and so there was this fight at the hangar between Michael Jackson and Mark Wahlberg. And Mark Wahlberg's a guy, I mean, on one level I have a lot of respect for him because, he started off as an underwear model, and I feel like he really did, he did something interesting. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. But he's also always seemed like a little bit of a dick to me. So I was as I'm reading the story, I'm rooting for Michael, and so the way it went down is they have this fight on the tarmac. It's Michael's posse against Mark Wahlberg's posse. And they're both on their cell phones to Sony at the same time that they're fighting with each other. And Michael won, of course, and sort of sent Mark Wahlberg scurrying. But then he did this beautiful thing. He put his family on the plane and sent it off. And then he called Sony and told him he wanted another plane for himself. And Mark Wahlberg ended up chartering a bus for his people. So I just thought, it just made me feel like I need to honor him tonight. But this is an essay that was kind of a fun and sort of unusually pure journalistic experience for me, because when he died, I was living for that summer in a cabin in Tennessee in the mountains. I had this teaching gig, and that was part of it. Was they gave you this cabin, and I was watching the coverage of his death on television and just getting more and more incensed at just how inane and judgmental and moralistic and shallow the discussion of him, that's sort of just centered on what a freak he had been. And then when it did veer over into his artistry or the parts of his life that were most interesting, it was quite shallow, I thought. So I had this urge to write something, and I called GQ, the magazine I was working for at the time, and said, please let me do it. And they said no. They felt like it was overexposed, and it was. I mean, it was everywhere, of course. You remember his death shut down Google, literally. I think it was the only thing that's ever done that. But then whatever they had planned for the cover that month fell apart, and so they called back a couple of weeks later and said, could you do a cover piece on Michael? And they'd found this beautiful image of him that had never been published before from when he was about 20. He had just started changing his face, but hadn't changed it very much, and he had a kind of prepubescent mustache and was wearing sort of a sailor shirt. It was just a really strikingly unfamiliar picture of somebody you thought you knew so well. And so I sort of hung that up in the room I was writing in and started listening to his music and reading everything I could about him, and just went into a little cocoon. And they said, you have 3 weeks to do this story. So it was a good, rarely is your task presented so clearly in magazine writing. And I just felt like, they were just laying it there for me to attempt. So anyway, I wrote this story. It's just called Michael. I've made some little changes in pen. I also want to play you one song, not right now, but midway through. So I'll go ahead and get that queued up. I figured if I hold my phone to the microphone, you'll be able to hear it. It's a Michael song that I don't think anyone's heard before. How do you talk about Michael Jackson except that you mention Prince Screws? Prince Screws was an Alabama cotton plantation slave who became a tenant farmer after the Civil War, likely on his former master's land. His son, Prince Screws Jr., bought a small farm, and that man's son, Prince Screws III, left home for Indiana, where he found work as a Pullman porter, part of the exodus of Southern blacks to the northern industrial cities. There came a disruption in the line. This last Prince Screws, the one who went north, would have no sons. He had 2 daughters, Caddy and Hattie. Caddy gave birth to 10 children, the 8th boy, Michael, who would name his sons Prince to honor his mother, whom he adored, and to signal a restoration. So the ridiculous moniker given by a white man to his black slave, the way you might name a dog, was bestowed by a black king upon his pale-skinned sons and heirs in America. We took the name for an affectation and mocked it. Not to imply that it was above mockery, but of all the things that make Michael unknowable, thinking we knew him is maybe the most deceptive. Let's suspend it. Begin not with the mini-series childhood of Joseph's endless family practice sessions, but with the later, and it seems just as formative, Motown childhood from, say, 11 to 14. Years spent when not on the road, most often alone, behind security walls, with private tutors and secret sketchbooks. A cloud-headed child, he likes rainbows and reading. He starts collecting exotic animals. His eldest brothers had at one time been children who dreamed of child stardom. Michael never knows this sensation. By the time he achieves something like self-awareness, he is already a child star. The child star dreams of being an artist. Alone, he puts on classical records because he finds they soothe his mind. He also likes the old Southern stuff his Uncle Luther sings. His uncle looks back at him and thinks he seems sad for his age. This is in California, so poor brown Gary, with its poisonous air you could smell from leagues away, a decade's exposure to which may already have damaged his immune system in fateful ways, is the past. He thinks about things, and sometimes talks them over with his friends, Marvin Gaye and Diana Ross, when they are hanging out. He listens to albums and compares. The albums he and his brothers make have a few nice tunes to sell records, then a lot of consciously second-rate numbers to satisfy the format. Whereas Tchaikovsky and people like that, they didn't handle slack material. But you have to write your own songs if that's what you want. Michael has always made melodies in his head, little riffs and beats, but that isn't the same. The way Motown deals with the Jackson 5, finished songs are delivered to the group from songwriting teams in various cities, including this one. The brothers are brought in to sing and add accents. Michael wants access to the anatomy of the music. That's the word he uses repeatedly, anatomy. What's inside its structure that makes it move? When he's 17, he asks Stevie Wonder to let him spy while Songs in the Key of Life gets made. There's Michael, self-consciously shy and deferential, flattening himself moth-like against the Motown studio wall. Somehow, Stevie's blindness becomes moving in this context. No doubt he is, for long stretches, unaware of Michael's presence. Never asks him to play a shaker or anything. Never mentions Michael. But Michael hears him. Most of the Jackson siblings are leaving Motown at this moment for another label where they've leveraged a bit more creative sway. The first thing Michael does is write Blues Away, an unfairly forgotten song, fated to become one of the least dated sounding tracks the Jacksons do together. A nice rolling piano riff with strings and a breathy chorus. Burt Bacharach doing Stevie doing early disco. And some other factor that was Michael's own, that dwelt in his introverted sounding vocal rhythms. Sweet, slightly cryptic lyrics that contain an early notion of melancholy as final, inviolable retreat. I'd like to be yours tomorrow, so I'm giving you some time to get over today, but you can't take my blues away. By 1978, the year of Shake Your Body Down to the Ground, co-written by Michael and Little Randy, Michael's methods have gelled. He starts with tape recorders. He sings and beatboxes the little things he hears, the parts. Where do they come from? Above. He claims to drop to his knees and thank Jehovah after he snatches one. His voice coach tells the story of Michael one day raising his hands in the air during practice and starting to mutter. The coach, Seth Riggs, decides to leave him alone. When he comes back half an hour later, it's to Michael whispering, "Thank you for my talent." Some of the things Michael hears in his head, he exports to another instrument, to the piano, which he plays not well but passably, or to the bass. The melody and a few percussive elements remain with his vocal. The rest he assembles around it. He has his brothers and sisters with him. He conducts. His art will come to depend on his ability to stay in touch with that childlike inner instrument, keeping near enough to himself to heed his own melodic promptings. If you've ever listened to toddlers making up songs, the things they invent are often bafflingly catchy and ingenious. They compose to biorhythms somehow. The vocal from Michael's earlier off-the-wall era demo of the eventual Thriller hit Wanna Be Startin' Something sounds like nothing so much as playful schoolyard taunting. He will always be at his worst when making what he thinks of as big music, which he invariably associates with military imagery. 1979, the year of Off the Wall and his first nose job, marks an obscure crisis. Around the start of that year, they offer him the gay lead in the film version of a chorus line, but he declines the role, explaining, "I'm excited about it, but if I do it, people will link me with the part. Because of my voice, some people already think I'm that way, homo, though I'm actually not at all." People want to know, why, when you became a man, did your voice not change? Rather, it did change, but what did it change into? Listening to clips of his interviews through the 70s, you can hear how he goes about changing it himself. First, it deepens slightly, around 1972 to 73 or so. Listen to him on The Dating Game in 1972, and you'll hear that his voice was lower at 14 than it will be at 30. This potentially catastrophic event has perhaps been vaguely dreaded by the family and label for years. Michael Jackson without his falsetto is not the commodity on which their collective dream depends. But Michael has never known a reality that wasn't susceptible on some level to his creative powers. He works to develop something, not a falsetto, which is a way of singing above your range, but instead a higher range. He isolates totally different configurations of his vocal cords, finding their crevices, cultivating the flexibility there. Vocal teachers will tell you this can be done, though it's considered an extreme practice. Whether the process is conscious in Michael's case is unknowable. He probably evolves it in order to keep singing Jackson 5 songs every night through puberty. The startling effect is of his having imaginatively not so much castrated himself as feminized himself. He essentially evolves a drag voice. On the early demo for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, recorded at home with Randy and Janet helping, you can actually hear him work his way into that voice. It's a character, really. "We're going to be starting now, baby," he says, in a relaxed, moderately high-pitched male voice. Then he intones the title, "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough," in a softer, quieter version of basically the same voice. He repeats the line in a still higher register, "Don't stop till you get enough," almost purring. Finally, in a full-on girlish peal, he sings. A source will later claim that Michael once, in a moment of anger, broke into a deep, gruff voice she'd never heard before. Liza Minnelli also claims to have heard this other voice. Interesting that these outflashings of his natural voice occurred at moments when he was, as we would say, not himself. On the internet, you can see a picture of him near the end of his life, juxtaposed with a digital projection of what he would have looked like at the same age without the surgeries and makeup and wigs. A smiling, middle-aged black guy, handsome in an everyday way. We are meant, of course, to feel a connection with this lost never-being, and pity for the strange, self-mutilated creature beside him. I can't be alone, however, in feeling just the opposite, that there's something metaphysically revolting about the mock-up. It's an abomination. Michael chose his true face. What is natural. His physical body is arguably, even inarguably, the single greatest piece of postmodern American sculpture. It should be carefully preserved. It's fascinating to read the interviews he gave to Ebony and Jet over the past 30 years. I confess myself disoriented by them. During whole stretches of years when the big media were reporting endlessly on his bizarreness and reclusiveness, he was every so often granting these intimate and illuminating sit-downs to those magazines, never forgetting to remind them that he trusted only them, would speak only to them. The articles made me realize that about the only Michael I'd ever known, personality-wise, was a Michael defending himself against white people who were passive-aggressively insinuating that he was a child molester. He spoke differently to black people, was more at ease. The language and grain of detail are different. Not that the scenario was any more journalistically pure. The John H. Johnson publishing family, which puts out Jet and Ebony, had Michael's back, faithfully repairing and maintaining his complicated relations with the community, assuring readers that in the presence of Michael, you quickly look past the enigmatic icon's light, almost translucent skin and realize that this African-American legend is more than just skin deep. At times, especially when the homo issue came up, the straining required could turn comical, as in Ebony in 1982, talking about his obsessive male fans. Michael says, they come after us every way they can, and the guys are just as bad as the girls. Guys jump up on the stage and usually go for me and Randy. And then Ebony says, but that means nothing except that they admire you, doesn't it? Of course not. Even so, to hear Michael laid back and talking unpretentiously about art, the thing he most loved, that is a new Michael. A person utterly absent from, for example, Martin Bashir's infamous documentary, Living with Michael Jackson, in which Michael admitted sharing his bedroom with children. It's only after reading Jet and Ebony that one can understand how otherwise straightforward-seeming people of all races have stayed good friends with Michael Jackson these many years. He is charming. His mind is alive. What a pleasure to find him listening to early writing version demos of his own compositions and saying, listen to that, that's at home. Janet, Randy, me, you're hearing 4 basses on there. Or to hear him tell less prepackaged anecdotes, such as the one about a beautiful girl who froze in the aisle of an airplane and pissed all down her legs after spotting him. Or the blonde girl who kissed him in an airport and when he didn't respond asked, "What's wrong, you fag?" He grows tired of reminding people, there's a reason why I was created male. I'm not a girl. He does not state the reason. When Michael and Quincy Jones run into each other on the set of The Wiz, Michael remembers a moment from years before when Sammy Davis Jr. had taken Jones aside backstage somewhere and whispered, "This kid is something. He's amazing." Michael had tucked it away. He knows Jones's name from the sleeves of his father's jazz albums, knows Jones is a serious man. He waits till the movie is done to call him up. It's the fact that Jones intimidates him slightly that draws Jackson to him. He yearns for some competition larger than the old intrafamilial one, which he has long dominated. That was checkers. He wants chess. Fading child stars can easily insulate themselves from further motivation if they wish, and most do. It's perhaps the more human path. Michael seeks pressure instead at this moment. He recruits people who can drive him to, as he puts it, higher effort. Quincy Jones's nickname for him is Smelly. It comes from Michael's habit of constantly touching and covering his nose with the fingers of his left hand, a tic that becomes pronounced in news clips from this time. He feels embarrassed about his broad nose. Several surgeries later, after one assumes it had been deemed impolitic inside the Jackson camp to mention the earlier facial self-consciousness, the story is altered. We are told that when Michael liked a track in the studio, he would call it the Smelly Jelly. Both stories may be true. Smelly Jelly has the whiff of Jackson's weird infantile sayings. Later in life, when feeling weak, he would say to his people, "I'm hurting, blanket me," which could mean, among other things, time for my medicine. Michael knows he won't really have gone solo until his own songwriting finds the next level. He doesn't want inclusion. He wants awe. Jones has a trusted songwriter in his stable, the Englishman Rod Temperton of Heatwave fame, who brings in a song, "Rock With You." You guys remember that song, right? "Want to rock with you all night." It's very good. Michael hears it and knows it's a hit. He's not even worried about hits at this point, though, except as a kind of byproduct of perfection. He goes home and writes, "Don't stop till you get enough." Janet tinks on a glass bottle. Trusted Randy plays guitar. These are the two siblings whom Michael brings with him into the Quincy Jones adventure, to the innermost zone where he writes. We don't think of the family as having anything to do musically with his solo career except by way of guilt favors. But he feels confident with these two, needs to keep them woven into his nest. They are both younger than he, his baby sister. From the perspective of 30 years, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough is a much better track than Rock With You. One admires Rock With You, but melodically, Michael's song comes from a more distinctive place. You hear not slickness, but sophisticated instincts. Michael feels disappointed with Off the Wall. It wins a Grammy, spawns multiple #1 singles, dramatically raises Jackson's already colossal level of fame, redeems disco in the very hour and flash of disco's dying. Diana Ross, who once helped out the Jacksons by putting her lovely arm around them, wants Michael to be at her shows again, but not for his sake now, for hers. She isn't desperate by any means, but something has shifted. Quincy Jones and Bruce Swedian, the recording guru who works with him, both take to be absurd the mere idea of following up off the wall in terms of success. You do your best, but that kind of thing just happens if it happens, not to be counted on, not to be hoped for. Jones knows that. Not Michael. All he can see of Off the Wall is that the year had bigger records. He wants to make something, he says, that refuses to be ignored. At home, he demos Billie Jean with Randy and Janet. When what will be the immortal part comes around, she and Michael go, woo, 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 woo. From Michael's brain, then, through a portable tape recorder on into the home studio. Bruce Swedian comes over. Being Michael Jackson working on the follow-up to Off the Wall means sometimes your home demos are recorded at your home by the greatest audio engineer in the world. But for all that, the team works in a stripped-down fashion with no noise reduction. That's usually the best stuff, Michael says, when you strip it down to the bare minimum and go inside yourself and invent. I just paused. This is a thing that's little known about Michael, that he wrote most of his best songs. That was one of the little wormholes that I followed into him and into trying to like defamiliarize him a little bit, because I just never thought of him as a songwriter. But he wrote Billie Jean and Beat It and Shake Your Body Down to the Ground, and which is saying a lot. On this home demo, made between the writing version and the album version, you get to hear Michael's early mystical placeholder vocals laid down before he'd written the verses. We hear him say, more kick and stuff in the phones. I need a more bottom and kick in the phones. And then the music. And then we hear him sing, and this is the first ever recording of this song, and this is what he does either live or he's maybe reading from a notebook. You can't really tell. It goes, oh, to say, on the phone to stay. Oh, born out of time, all the while I see other eyes. One at a time we'll go where the winds unwind. She told me her voice belonged to me, and I'm here to see. She called my name, then she said hello. Oh, then I died and said, gotta go in a ride. Billie Jean is not my lover. She's just a girl who says that I'm the one. The kid is not my son. He already had that part down. A big, round, warm, Scandinavian type, Swedian comes from Minnesota, made his mark doing classical, but with classical engineering, it's all about fidelity, he knew, and he wants to be part of the making, to help shape the songs. So, a frustrated anatomist himself, coming down from high to low formally and meeting Michael on his way up. Quincy, in the middle with his jazz cool, calls Swedian Svensk. The white man has the endearing habit of lifting both hands to massage the gray walrus wings of his mustache. He has a condition called synesthesia, a bad case. It means that when he listens to sound, he sees colors. He knows the mix is right only when he sees the right colors. Michael loves singing for him. In a seminar room in Seattle at an Audio Pro Recording Geek conference, Swedian talks about his craft. He plays his recording of Michael's flawless one-take vocal from The Way You Make Me Feel, sans effects of any kind, to let the engineers in the audience hear the straight dope, a great mic on a great voice with as little interference as possible, the right angle, the right deck, everything. Someone in the audience raises a hand and asks if it's hard recording Michael's voice, given that, as Swedian mentioned before, Michael is very physical. At first, Swedian doesn't cotton. Yeah, that is a bit of a problem, he answers, but I've never had an incident where the microphone has been damaged. One time, though, the guy interrupts. No, not to do damage. I'm just asking about the proximity thing. Oh, Swedian says, suddenly understanding. His voice drops to a whisper. He's unbelievable. He gives the most beautiful description. Michael records in the dark, he says, and he'll dance. And picture this, you're looking through the glass, and it's dark, with a little pin spot on him. Sweetian lifts his hand to suggest a narrow cone of light shining directly down from overhead. And you'll see the mic here, and he'll sing his lines, and then he disappears. In the outer dark, Michael is dancing, fluttering. That's all Quincy and Sweetian know. And Sweetian punches the air right back in front of the mic at the precise instant. Sweetian invents a special zippered covering for miking the bass drum on Billie Jean, a muffled enclosure. It gives the song that mummified heartbeat intensity which you have seen make a dance floor come to life. The layered bass sounds on the 1 and the 3 lend a lurching feline throb. Bass drum, bass guitar, double synthesizer bass, the 4 basses Michael talked about, all hitting together, doing the part that started as he and Janet going, woo, woo, that came from Jehovah. Its tempo is like the pulse of a sleeping person. Michael finds himself back in the old Motown building for a day, doing some video mixing, when Berry Gordy approaches and asks him to be in the 25th anniversary special on NBC. Michael demurs. A claustrophobic moment for him. All that business, his brothers, Motown, the Jackson 5, the past, that's all a cocoon he's been writhing inside, finally chewing through. He knows that Billie Jean has exploded. He's becoming something else. But the animal inside him that is his ambition senses an opportunity. He strikes his legendary deal with Gordy, that he'll perform with his brothers only if he's allowed to do one of his own solo post-Motown hits as well. Gordy agrees. What Michael does with his moment, given the context, given that his brothers have just left the stage, and that the stage belongs to Mr. Berry Gordy, is outrageous. In the by now totemic YouTube clips of this performance, Michael's preamble is usually cut off, which makes it worth watching the disc. It also that disc also has, I think, Marvin Gaye's last live performance on it. So if you ever get a chance to see it, it was kind of an amazing show. Those of you who are as old as I am remember it was like one of the main TV moments. And, you knew that like the entire country was watching the same show. Michael is sweaty and strutting. "Thank you. Oh, you're beautiful. Thank you," he says, almost slurring with sexiness. You can tell he's worked out all his nerves on the Jackson 5 songs. Now he owns the space as if it were the inside of his cage. Millions upon millions of eyes. I have to say, those were the good old days, he rambles on. I love those songs. Those were magic moments with all my brothers, including Jermaine. The Jackson family's penchant for high passive aggression at watershed moments is extraordinary. At Michael's funeral, Jermaine will say, "I was his voice and his backbone. I had his back." And then, as if remembering to thank his agent, "So did the family." Those were good songs, Michael says. I like those songs a lot, but especially I like... His voice fades from the mic for a second, ramifying the liveness till the meters almost spike. Especially I like the new songs. Uncontrollable shrieking. He's grabbing the mic stand like James Brown used to grab it, like if it had a neck, he'd be choking it. People in the seats are yelling, "Billie Jean!" I won't cloud the uniqueness of what he does next with words, except to mention one potentially missable, because it's so obvious, aspect, that he does it so entirely alone. The stage is profoundly empty. You'd never see such a thing today. Silhouettes of the orchestra members are clapping back in the dark. But unless you count the dazzling glove, conceived, according to one source, to hide the advancing vitiligo that discolors his left hand, Michael holds only one prop, a black hat. He tosses it away almost immediately. Stage, dancer, spotlight. The microphone isn't even on. He snatches it back from the stand as if from the hands of a maddening child. With a mime's tools, he proceeds to do possibly the most captivating thing a person's ever been captured doing on stage. Richard Pryor, who was not in any account I have ever read a suck-up, approaches Michael afterward and says simply, "That was the greatest performance that I have ever seen." Fred Astaire calls him the greatest living natural dancer, which is both sort of weird and racist in some creepy way, but also kind of true. I mean, why was, like Fred Astaire wasn't a natural dancer? Was he, like a mathematical dancer or something? Michael tells Ebony, "I remember doing that performance so clearly, and I remember that I was upset with myself because it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted it to be more." It's said he intended to hold the crouching en pointe at the end of the moonwalk longer. But if you watch, he falls off his toes when he does fall in perfect time and makes it part of the turn. Much as closer to the end, he wipes sweat from under his nose in time. The intensity behind his face looks all but unbearable. Quincy always tells him, "Smelly? Get out of the way and leave room so that God can walk in." A God moves through him. The God enters. The God leaves. Then I'll just read this last section. It's odd to write about a person knowing he may have been, but not if he was, a serial child rapist. Whether or not Michael did it, the suggestion of it shadowed him for so long and finally killed his soul. It's said that toward the end he was having himself put under, with the same anesthesia that finished him, not for hours, but for days, as though being snuffed. Witnesses to his body on the morgue table report that his prosthetic nose was missing. There were only holes in his face, a mummy. 2 separate, complete autopsies. They cut him to pieces. As of this writing, no one outside the Jackson camp knows for certain the whereabouts of his body. I have read a stack of books about him in the past month, more than I ever imagined I would, though not more than I wanted. He warrants and will no doubt one day receive a serious objective biography. All the great cultural strains of American music came together in him. We have yet to accept that his very racial in-betweenness made him more and not less of an essential figure in our tradition. He grasped this and used it. His marriage to Elvis's daughter was mainly an art piece. I don't really know whether that's true. That's the one sentence where I think, okay, maybe that's... Possibly he loved her. I'm not saying he didn't. Of all those books, the one that troubles and sticks with me is the celebrity journalist Ian Halpern's Unmasked, The Final Years of Michael Jackson. Most famous for a book and movie suggesting dubiously that Kurt Cobain's suicide was a disguised murder at the hands of his wife, who, despite the fact that she can barely pour a bowl of cereal without vomiting and hardening herself, was somehow able to prosecute a vast criminal conspiracy and get away with it. Halpern is not an ideal source, but neither is he a dismissible one. Indeed, he accurately predicted Michael's death 6 months before it happened and seems to have burrowed his way into the Jackson world in several places. In the beginning, Halpern claims he'd set out mainly to prove that Michael had sexually molested young boys and used his money to get away with it. I believe him about this original motivation, since any such proof would have generated the most sensational publicity and sold the most copies. But Halpern finds in the end, after exhaustively pursuing leads, that every so-called thread of evidence becomes a rope of sand. Somebody, even if it's a family member, wants money, or has accused other people before, or is patently insane. It usually comes down to a tale someone else knows about an alleged secret payoff. And of course, once it became known that Michael was weird about kids, he became a target for such people. Meanwhile, you have these boys like Macaulay Culkin, whom Michael was also once accused of fondling, who have come forward and stated that nothing untoward ever happened with Michael. When he stood trial and got off, that was a just verdict, Halpern argues. I have to say the most convincing story I've ever heard along this line was from one of the Phoenix brothers, I think. Not River, and not Joaquin either, but I think the third one that you don't hear a lot about. And he was with someone else. Anyway, they were with Michael at Neverland, and they were 13 or whatever. And being 13-year-olds, they wanted to look at porn. And they asked Michael, let's look at porn, because you're an adult, you must have some. And Michael wouldn't do it. He was like, oh, that's creepy. I think that's kind of telling. That's the first half of the Halpern thesis. The second half is that Michael was a fully functioning gay man who took secret male lovers his entire adult life. Halpern says he met 2 of them and saw pictures of a third with Michael. They were young but perfectly legal. One told Halpern that Michael was an insatiable bottom. As for Michael's interest in children, it's hard to imagine that lacking an erotic dimension of some kind, but it may well have been thoroughly non-sexual. Michael was a frozen adolescent, about the age of those first dreamy striped sweater years in California, and he wanted to hang out with the people he saw as his peers, have pillow fights, call each other doo-doo head. It's creepy as hell if you like, but victimless. It would make him, in rough clinical terms, a partial, passive, fixated pedophile. Not a crime yet, not until they get the mind reader machines going. I don't ask that you agree with Halpern, merely that you admit, as I feel compelled to do, that the psychological picture he conjures up is not less and perhaps just slightly more plausible than the one in which Michael for decades uses Neverland successfully as a spider web, luring boys to his bed. If you're like me, you've been subconsciously presuming the latter to be basically the case for most of your life. But there's a good chance it was never true, and that Michael loved children with a weird but not immoral love. If you want a disturbing thought experiment, allow these, I won't say facts, but feasibility structures. Let them digest. And then go back again to Bashir's 2003 documentary. There's no point adding here to the demonization of Bashir for having more or less manipulated Michael through kindness into declaring himself a complete fruit-of-the-loom collecting fiend, especially when you consider that Bashir was representing us fairly well in the ideas he appears to have carried in regarding Michael, that it was probably all true about him and kids. But when you put on the not true glasses and watch, and see Michael protesting his innocence, asking what's wrong with sharing love as he holds hands with that 12-year-old cancer survivor, or many years earlier in that strange self-released statement where he describes with barely suppressed rage the humiliation of having his penis examined by the police. Damn it if the whole life doesn't look a lot different. There appears to exist at least a non-dismissible chance that Michael was some kind of martyr. We won't pity him, that he embraced his destiny, despite knowing, as he must have known, that fame would warp him, is precisely what frees us to revere him. We have, in any case, a pathology of pathologization in this country. It's a bourgeois disease, and we do right to call bullshit on it. As Czeslaw Milosz once wrote in response to a critic, if I am sick, well, there is no proof at all that man is a healthy creature. We moan that Michael changed his face out of self-loathing. He may have loved what he became. Ebony caught up with him in Africa in the mid-90s. He had just been crowned King of Sani by villagers in the Ivory Coast. You know I don't give interviews, he tells Robert E. Johnson there in the village. You're the only person I trust to give interviews to. He went on. deep inside, I feel that this world we live in is really a big, huge, monumental symphonic orchestra. I believe that in its primordial form, all of creation is sound, and that it's not just random sound, that it's music. May they have been his last thoughts. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Want to take some questions?
I'm happy to, yeah. Doesn't have to be about that piece,
Yeah.
if you're feeling too uncomfortable. Yeah.
You never played the song.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, I'll just play the beginning of it. Yeah, it's so good. When you consider this is the first thing you ever wrote, it's really... Can you see them in that picture? They look so... He does that thing that, it's like the first time he does that. Anyway, I'll send it to anybody who wants to hear it. I'm giving you some time to ba-da. Love that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess I can just ask, what was the recording process like for that piece? Because you covered so many different moments from his life, and how could you have known about the details of each of those moments?
I just read really like in a really targeted and sort of hungry, mercenary way, because I knew I needed as many little facts like that as I can get, and then something came from just like removing them from context. So for instance, I read an interview with his uncle Luther, and they're asking him, what do you remember about Michael? And he's saying things like, well, I always remembered he was kind of sad. He seemed sad for such a young kid, but I used to play blues songs, and he would ask me to play blues songs on my guitar. And so that, every little moment that was unfamiliar like that stuck out, I would put it in the notes. And then something happens when you just pull it out of quotation marks, and just state it as a fact. And sort of weave it into it, another kind of narrative tone. It's cheating in a way, but without cheating. I mean, you can reach a tone almost of a kind of omniscient, like you were sort of there observing his childhood, but really you're just using every fact you could find and kind of like sublimating them, into the story. So I just tried to do that every chance I got, pretty much. Yeah. Oh, there's a microphone.
Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Just
Yeah.
because we were recorded as well.
Yeah, sure.
In Hey Mickey, the Disney piece, I found your ending incredibly striking, and it stays with me, the thunderstorm. And I feel like in your pieces you often choose these moments which happen in reality and sum up what you're trying to say very well and very strikingly. This might be a difficult question, but how would you have ended Hey Mickey if that thunderstorm hadn't happened? I mean, how else would you have written that? I mean, because it's so perceptive, that he sees reality as better than fiction.
Right.
But I mean, how did you make it up? Did you make it up?
Yeah, turns out fiction's better than reality. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, that was a particularly lucky example, I guess, because life did sort of just give me the ending. I mean, it was so crazy, that last experience. But I think I would have ended it with that scene on the water slide before, when, talking about how we're not really responsible for our children. A convenient thesis for that essay. But there's always something like that, and it'll come along, and you feel like this was the end of the experience, or this is somehow the end of this chain of thought, and the trick is making it feel inevitable for the reader, or at least making it feel satisfying. And I think the trick to doing that in turn is just to be bold about it, to be not to the most dangerous and self-undermining thing you can do with endings is to make them ending-y. They have to really be an ending. There's something, something happens and the curtain comes down, and you have to train your instincts to feel when it's conceivable that the curtain can come down, when that won't feel totally premature or abrupt or like a non sequitur or something, and you just become sensitive to those moments. Like, it's almost like you find yourself, you write yourself into the piece in such a way that your narrator starts to want out, and then at a certain point the door opens and you leave, or at least that's how it works for me, and how I can do it without feeling sort of like terribly arbitrary about it, like, oh, he just decided to write the ending here or whatever. I never want the reader feeling that, Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about the motivation behind the piece in the book that is made up.
Partly
made up.
I invented a narrator in order to deliver the true facts. Yeah.
What was the motivation behind that?
Psychosis. It was. I mean, literally, it was. I had been assigned to write a piece about this institute at Oxford University that called the Future of Humanity Institute, and I went over there and did some reporting there. But it was kind of a bust. They didn't really have a lot to say. Apparently, there is no future. But they'd already paid me for the piece, so I got home and had to write something. And I did have this obsession with animal attacks, and so it just and also on a. I mean, this is only barely true. It's mostly self-justification, but it's slightly true that piece was written at the height of like post 9/11 fear-mongering with all the alert codes and where it's stage yellow and everything, and that. So I thought like it could be useful just to show people how easy it is to scare people. How easy it is to just throw together a bunch of facts and make people feel like, oh, we ought to really be worried about this, as a prank, so there's a prankish kind of element to it,
Do you still collect corroborating evidence with regards to that?
Well, I don't have a choice, because now, of course, since the book came out, people send them to me from all over the world. I mean, the folder I have now is like 10 times the size of the one I had when I wrote the piece, and you would not believe the stuff that's happening out there.
How many people have sent in stories? I mean, it's like hundreds of people, thousands. I mean, how many people?
I would say hundreds, not thousands, but definitely hundreds. Yeah, I mean, since I wrote the article, it's well into the hundreds. Yeah. Some are repeat senders. Yeah.
When you write about different kinds of music, are you aware of varying the syntax and rhythm of your sentences? Say when you write about the blues versus writing about Michael.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I never thought about it, or it never became visible to me. But I'm just thinking right now about the blues essay and the one I just read, or like the one about Axl Rose. The diction is very different, and probably that has something to do with the lyrics, like picking up something. If the lyrics are poppy, then the prose is a little choppier. But like with that blues piece has a kind of formality to it. It would have seemed really inappropriate to write about that music with that poppier tone. But not just music though. I think I mean, and you must do this too. I mean, I think whatever I'm writing about, I'm absorbing tone from it. You're sort of sponging up tone. and not just analyzing it in a distant way, but reflecting it, reflecting it back. So I think there's some of that going on.
Man, yeah. I want to ask you about like adopting persona in your pieces, because a lot of your stories, obviously you're in it, it's the first person, and so you have to play the role of the persona of John inside the story.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I was just noticing it, even though the Michael Jackson piece, you're not in the story, one thing that you seem to take a moment to really notice and to give credence is Michael Jackson's personas. Like, he invented that, but it's still completely legit, what you're saying, which is something that the mainstream culture tends to criticize a lot. The way he altered himself was somehow false, but you're saying really that's him because he made that decision. Anyway, this is like a roundabout way of asking if you could talk a little bit about how you gauge your own persona in pieces where that you were the main character, where persona is important.
Yeah, I think that was a thing that never felt unnaturally to me, in large part because one of the first nonfiction, magazine essay type writers I came across was Terry Southern, who's kind of the forgotten new journalist, but the beginning of all that stuff. Wrote for Esquire in the 50s, before Hunter Thompson and Easy Rider, Dr. Strangelove, genius. But his narrators rarely had anything to do with him. I mean, they weren't made up. He was writing in the first person, but it was clear that he was thinking in fictional terms, like creating a little character who then gets moved through the piece like a piece on a game board, and it's the piece itself that dictates the pressure of what's going to work and what's not going to work. It's like it's a short story, Is the character plausible inside the context of that short story? That's the question you ask, not is it accurately reflecting my views or is it going to bring honor on me as a human being, that I've written about myself this way, but is it serving the storytelling? So I just very early on completely drank the Kool-Aid on that, and tried to tried to follow it and see if maybe it could be, moved a little, not beyond what Terry Southern did, because I don't fool myself into thinking I could do that, but just into other places where he didn't really go, That was sort of the technical motivation for a lot of the pieces in this book, I think.
Do you get any reaction from the family to that essay?
Yeah, Janet liked it, but Jermaine, her paramour at that time, Jermaine Dupree, not Jermaine Jackson, really didn't like it. He really got pissed off and said that I was throwing shade and all this stuff. And so GQ set up this cage match that Jermaine Dupree and I were going to go back and forth in the letters column. And he agreed to it. I don't know why, given the subsequent revelation, but then when it came time to do it, they were saying, well, what about the article did you object to? And he said, I didn't read that shit. And it turned out he just hated the title. So, which wasn't even mine, but the title was When Michael Was Cool or something, it did sound sort of, I don't know, I'm not sure that it was the best title, but that was it. I mean, you don't get a lot of feedback from the Jackson family generally, is my sense. They're pretty closed off.
So I think a lot of us in the audience tonight are or were students of nonfiction writing here at the university, and the first thing that you always have to do when you're writing a profile is try to get access to the person you're writing about. Yeah. And in a lot of your essays in Pulphead, you don't have access to the people you're writing about. So do you think that it is freeing to not have to talk to these people, or is it a workaround, like in the essay about Axl Rose where he refuses to talk to you?
Yeah. I think it can go both ways. I think my feeling on it is the more famous the person is, the less of a tragedy it is if you don't get access. Because celebrities almost always have nothing to say, or if they do have something to say, they've been trained not to say it, and the better they are. And I'm not just talking about, sort of vapid pop figures, but even really interesting people. They've been talking to reporters for so long that their language becomes sort of memorized and surfacey, and they're really smart about seeming to give you enough for your article but not giving you very much, right? But the problem is once you get that interview, like if I'd gotten that interview with Axel, I mean, that night in Spain when I was there with his manager, I could have lied. I could have said we're going to give him the cover and gotten that interview. It would have been a disaster for the article because he would have just said a bunch of stupid Axel crap. But the magazine would have been so excited, right, that we got him, that they would have made me give 4,000 words over to this interview with him, and there wouldn't have been room for, the other stuff that ended up happening. Like, I ended up doing the first interview with his oldest, best childhood friend who'd never talked to the media before. That guy had much more interesting things to say than Axel was going to say, So it's often a trade-off of political economy that way. You seem to be getting something, but you're giving up, I think, a lot more. Needless to say, it's very different if you're writing about, I don't know, a scientist who's just come up with a cure for cancer or something. I mean, you probably want to talk to that person, not to his mom or whatever. Yeah.
The key is probably to take them out drinking.
Yeah, anytime you can introduce
Let them talk through
substance into the right.
Do we have time for maybe one more question?
I'm happy as long as you guys want to talk. Yeah, this is an honor for me.
Thank you. I was just reading earlier today the article you wrote for the New York Times about the Williams sisters.
Oh, yeah.
And that kind of profile of their family and their lives. And I thought it was wonderful. And I think Kristen's question just spurred mine, which is that was there anything that you felt was lacking or disingenuous about that because you were talking to them? And I guess what that process was like for you, because I haven't found many recent profiles of them, and it was really great. And if you could talk a little about that. Yeah,
that's given what I just said, that's a totally acute question. I mean, I don't know. It was just there was something so great about Serena in her apartment in Paris. By herself. It was so unfamiliar, I mean, so she really kind of gave me what ordinarily I'm looking to get through other channels. It was just so weird. She was all sprawled out on the couch, her shirt was like up to her midriff. She was showing me scars everywhere, and she gave me whiskey. Yeah, it was great. But if I'm going to be totally honest, though, I mean, I probably was getting a little bit fooled there, too. I mean, she was definitely there. She insisted on doing it there. We could easily have met in Cincinnati 48 hours later. I already had to go to Cincinnati to see Venus. So she made me fly to Paris and then back to Cincinnati because she wanted to be seen in that environment. But I thought it was kind of cool. I don't know. I just thought, well, she's giving me something kind of beautiful, so I'm willing to trade a little bit here,
Is it ever hard to talk about, I guess, the negatives about people when they are living, they will see it or be affected, or like their father? Like, is it hard to feel like, oh, I'm writing these things that then he might read, or that they might read?
Yeah.
Kind of pressure?
Yeah, I don't think that ever totally goes away, that human thing of just not, I mean, you don't want to hurt people. And even if you do, it's awkward after you do it, But in that case, I just thought the real interest here is this family. Like, this is the story of a great American family at bottom. That's if this has real interest, that's where it lies. And so, and the quickest, easiest way to kill that would have been to kind of go soft on him and all of that, and he's kind of, he's a fascinating, but in some ways kind of a sinister figure. I think, he's he's physically abusive, which I didn't really even go into very deeply in the piece. They wouldn't really let me for legal reasons, but you know, he's trouble. Richard.
Well, maybe we can move the party to the back, and I'm sure John would be
Sure.
willing to talk to you
Yeah.
one-on-one if you have other questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.